Hi, I'm Rob Cosman. Welcome to my shop. Wondering why your shooting board doesn't work? Well, I'm going to go through and I'm going to explain some of the common problems that people have with them. It's one of the most critical tools in my shop, so stay tuned and I'll walk this through and hopefully solve your problem. I'm going to approach this from the perspective of somebody who's brand new to this sport. The shooting board is a simple device. It's designed to hold your workpiece and your plane at right angles. Right angles and looking in plan view, right angles this way and right angles this way. And the idea is that if you build your shooting board accurately, every time you do it, you're going to get the exact same result. That means that whatever you build, it's going to be a lot greater chance that it's going to come out just the way you expected because all of the parts and pieces have been squared. I always tell people, you have the option. You can put a board like this in your vise, and then using your plane, you can balance it in two directions. Balance it this way and balance it this way while you attempt to square off the end of the board to get rid of saw marks or to get it square. Well, I always explain you need to have that skill, but at the same time, it takes a lot of extra work and a lot of unnecessary risk when you could have a shooting board and just have that come out every time you do it. So I figured out there's probably about 6 main issues that people deal with shooting boards. Now remember, I used to anyway, travel all around and would teach people how to do this. And although we make shooting boards and sell them, a lot of people choose to do it themselves. We've shot a video on how to do that. We'll leave a link below. Telling you all more things that I've discovered over the years that will make it a good, accurate tool. But I'm going to go through the 06 and I'll try to explain them in as good a detail as I can and help you diagnose that. Now, part of being a good woodworker is being able to A, fix problems so that you can continue on building what you're building and not have anybody know the difference, and B, being able to look at something, figure out what's wrong, and then diagnose it, repair it, and you're back at work. So we'll start off with what I know for a fact is the #1 problem that folks have with shooting boards. What do you need to have? You need to have a blade that is properly sharpened and at its peak level of performance so that you can take the smallest of shavings with the least amount of effort and get predictable results. So when people struggle with a shooting board, if their blade is not sharp enough, the first thing they tend to do, now remember, I'm talking about people who are just getting started in this, the first thing they think is, oh, I don't have enough blade exposure, so they're going to crank the blade out a little bit more, which will only compound the problem. So you have to have a very sharp blade. Now, I'm not going to go through in this video and show you how to sharpen because we've done that in our 32 seconds to sharp. We'll leave that link as well. But if you're even in the slightest bit of doubt as to how sharp it is, and I'll tell you another thing that you'll notice, is if the edge starts to break down and it's very easy to see an end grain, you'll see lines going across the end grain of the board. You know right then and there, this is not sharp, it has to be repaired. All right, I've already alluded to what we're going to call the second problem, but even though I alluded to it, I'm going to define it as a second problem all by itself. And that is the blade's out too far. Remember, you're cutting through end grain. And most often, the blade is out too far because it was dull, and in trying to get it to cut, you thought, okay, I need to have more blade. But that's just makes it extremely difficult. So with the blade out too far, there's a nice, easy cut, pulling off a relatively thin shaving. If I advance that blade, this becomes a real hard push. And the harder you push, the less control you have. It's not fun. Hey, if you like this video, we have more. Our monthly newsletter has subscriber-only content, discounts monthly on tools, and anything we bring out that's new, subscribers get first crack at it. Click on the link below. Let's get back to work. This is something my son developed called the grip. And it's made out of it's aluminum with a rubber sleeve glued to it. It drops in there, so you've got to drill a little 1/4-inch hole. And if that worries you, then you won't want to do this. But if you're more concerned about using your plane accurately, you will. That sits in there like that, and because the blade's right there, you get tons of control, and it's a really great way to grip your plane, no pun intended. There's one more thing I need to tell you about. Being able to adjust your blade is a big deal when you're doing this. And this is something we made called the adjustar. The round wheel that was on there for years was so hard to turn, sometimes I'd have to take two hands to do it. Now, because of these paddles, I can simply turn that without even thinking about it. So here's how I start the process. I pull the blade all the way in. And then as I'm planing, I just start to advance it a little bit at a time until I pick up what I want. And I'm not in any rush. When I start to hear some contact, then I'll just make it a much smaller adjustment. And now you've got something that's not hard to push through, yet it allows you to plane the end of that board. If you plane across the end of the board, what's going to happen right here is those fibers are going to break out. It's inevitable. It's just the way this wood is structured. So what you do in the process of getting this ready, and this is my trued edge that I want against the fence. So just prior to planing, what I'm going to do is turn this over, make sure it's tight against the fence, then pull it away in this corner. And right here, I'm going to cut a little chamfer on this end. Now you can see it goes right up to there, the light's shining right. Then I flip it over like this. Put this in position, and now if I look over here, I can see the gap that I just created. And if I was making this to an accurate line, I would have had a mark on here, and I would have made sure that when I did my little chamfer like that, that I took it right to the mark. Then I come in here and I start planing, and I'm watching that little chamfer, because if I go too far and I go past it, it's going to blow those fibers out. I need to stop, ideally, right at it, but if nothing else, just a little bit short. And there's where it stops right there, so I probably wouldn't want to go any farther than that. And that will allow you to protect this and not have that big chunk out. If you do tear it out, you've either got to take material off of here, or you've got to take material off the end, and you can't always do that. So you have to be careful to protect that. Some people will put another piece of wood up in there, and you can do that as well. And the reason we don't do that with our fence is because sooner or later this gets chewed up, and you can no longer rely on that. So I always just assume you have to cut your little chamfer before you plane across the end of a board. All right, I'd call this next problem one of the two fundamental issues with your shooting board. And that is you've planed the end, but when you put your square, now you're always referencing off of that prepared surface. This one may or may not be, but whatever one is laying down here on the top of your shooting board has to be the flattened, trued surface. And of course, the trued edge always goes up against the fence. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to check this direction. Now that's square. If it wasn't, there's two problems. Either my blade is not projecting parallel to the sole, and I always start by eyeballing, clean the sole off, wipe one way, up against a nice light colored background. I'm looking down the sole and I've got it tipped just slightly. And right here I can see the blade, and it just shows up as a thin black line. My lateral adjustment lever, that's right underneath the blade, controls the blade. As I move that one side or the other, it's going to cause the blade to shift like this in position, which means it'll either put the right side up higher than the left side or vice versa. I want that to be looking so that it's parallel to the sole. Same amount of projection here as I see over there. And I can't believe how common of a problem this is in teaching new people how to use a hand plane. You really need to be able to identify that by eye. Sometimes what I'll do is I will bring the blade out quite far. Now I'm looking down there and I see lots of blade, obviously more than I'm going to want to actually use in shooting. At this point, I'll use my lateral adjustment lever to get that blade dialed in so it appears to be parallel to the sole. Then I'll retract it. And as I'm pulling the blade in, one side may disappear sooner than the other. That allows me to fine-tune that. And I'll get it so that both sides disappear at the same time, and then I drop the blade all the way in. At that point, I'll then come in, as I mentioned, start planing, and advance the blade until I start to pick up a shaving and I get the appropriate size cut that I'm looking for. So that's issue number one, blade not parallel to the sole. Issue number two is a little more problematic. and that is when your plane is laying on your shooting board, that it's not square here. So I'm going to come in with my square and check it. Now there's a reason why it may not be, and I'm going to address it. The first one is that your plane may not have square sides. So what you need to do is set your plane, your square, on the sole, come in there onto the side and look and see. And there shouldn't be a great amount of light. Surprisingly enough, even a little tiny gap can show up or appear to be a whole lot more than you would expect. Most good plane manufacturers are going to hold to about 1.5 thou. So if you can dig out your, where is my, no, it's not on this one. There it is right there. There's my 0.0015. Make sure that's the only one. Sometimes there's a couple of them that are stuck together. Loosen that up a little bit. Lock that in place. So with my square on here, make sure I've got nothing underneath and make sure I don't have any glue on my square. I'm going to press that against the sole and drop that down. And I shouldn't be able to pull that out. As long as I can feel resistance, then I'm going to be within 1.5 thou and I can work with that. If it's out a lot more than that, well, you've got two options. Return your plane, if it's brand new, take it to a shop that can actually mill that side for you, or you've got a certain amount of lateral adjustment with your blade. So you can compensate for maybe 2 thou being out, but beyond that, it may be a little bit difficult. And what I mean by that is, if my side is at a square and it's tipping out like this, then I need to have more blade sticking out the top than the bottom. And what that means is that you've got to come in there and play around with this, make the adjustment, take a couple passes on a scrap, check it with your square. When you get it right, okay, you're good to go. What I don't like about that is every time I go from using my plane on the shooting board to on my bench, I've got to put that blade back in position and, of course, go through this process again, which is a bit of a pain. That's the reason why you really want to get your plane with square sides. That's the easy problem. Well, I shouldn't say the easy problem, but that's one of the big ones. The next one is your actual shooting board. Now, this one might be a little more difficult to explain, but I'll try my best. So we make our shooting boards out of 2 pieces. MDF on the bottom. Why? Well, it's got a hard-wearing surface, and it tends to be very stable. The top piece is a piece of Baltic birch, which is just really good plywood. And the Baltic birch is there because your blade does not go all the way to the bottom of the sole. So when you set it on here, you have to elevate your workpiece to get it up into the blade. In other words, you wouldn't be able to plane much because that part would be rubbing on the board and it's not being cut. Okay, that often creates a stress line in the structure, and it may cause the board to cup a little bit. If it cups, meaning it goes like this, here's what's going to happen. Your plane is made in such a way that it's wide here, narrow out there. The minute it's no longer sitting flat and it's resting or it's bridging a cup, what's going to happen, and I'll demonstrate this, I'm going to take my square, and you can see right now that that's nice and square, but if I were to put a piece of material underneath here and do that, all of a sudden, well, I need more than that. Let's be real extreme. I'm going to take a steel rule in here. So as soon as I do that, you'll watch what happens. It's going to cause this plane to tip out like that. Now when I put my square on there, you can see the gap. That's what happens if your shooting board has cupped and now it's bridging from here to here. So what we do when we make our shooting boards is we purposely form them, in other words, glue this piece to the MDF piece over a mold that puts in a little bit of a shape like this. Under those circumstances, as long as it's convex, and the plane is always going to be sitting on the wide spot, and that's going to keep it square. If anything, as you bear down on it, it's just going to push it flat, but it's never going to be in that cup situation which causes it to tip out, and you no longer have a square setup. That one you got to watch for. It took a long time before I discovered that. Could never figure out why this shooting board I was making just wasn't working, and I could never get things squared up, and I checked it one day, and I said, oh. So watch for that one. Kind of a fatal flaw in your shooting board if that happens, and you got to start over. But just remember, form it over and I'll tell you this, when we do that, I think we take 5 or 6 pieces of masking tape on the form. We put 5 or 6 strips in the middle, stacked one on top of the other, and then a couple inches of either side. We'll do maybe 2 less pieces of masking tape, and then a couple inches to the left and right, a couple less pieces of masking tape. And that creates just enough of a curvature like that. So when you glue and clamp this down, it gives that little permanent cup, not much, but just enough to avoid the problem we just mentioned. Next fundamental flaw is your planing. You're squaring up your boards, but then when you put a square on, referencing from your straight edge, the true edge, and you check, and son of a gun, it's not square. Well, the first thing I would suggest is you always want to make sure that that edge that's going up against your fence, that has to be straight, and you have to have verified that. Second thing you're going to make sure is that this fence has to be straight. If there's a bump in there, it's always going to be rocking on you like this. Even if there's some debris in there, you want to make sure that's nice and clean. So check that with a straight edge, and I would use your feeler gauge again to make sure that all along there, when you put pressure, it traps the straight edge. So we know that is straight. So assuming these 2 pieces come in good contact and there's no side-to-side movement, that checks out. Next thing you're going to do is check and make sure that that is actually square to this track. So using a really good, reliable square, and you got to spend some money to get a good one, I'm going to avoid where the blade is sticking out. I'm going to put that in here, and I'm going to move it over, and I'm going to, again, I'm going to go in, and I'm going to check to make sure that that is nice and tight so I don't have an issue. If it's not, you have 2 options. You can go in and you can take some material off of here, or you can go in and you can take some material off of here. Let's address this one first. Now you can use a shoulder plane, or if you're lucky enough to have a 10 1/4, which is a bench rabbiting plane, the blade goes all the way to either side. I would set it up so it's flush with this, and depending on which way this needs to be moved, I've either got to take some material off of here or off of here. If I had to take some material off of here, I would set this up, clamp it in place, set my plane right here with a very light cut, and I would take a pass. And then I would back up a little bit beyond where I started, and I would take another pass. And I would come back and take another pass. And I would keep working my way back until I take a full pass to clean everything up. And hopefully what I've just done is taken that surface and moved it like this or like this, depending on what the problem was. Make sure it's straight. That means you got to go back in with your straight edge and your feeler gauge to make sure you want that board to lay nice and flat against that. If it was the other way around and we need to remove this material, then depending on the grain direction, I could flip it over like this and do the same thing. Or if the grain direction was such that I had to plane in that direction, then I would start here, I would take a pass, and while moving forward, I would disengage right about here. Now, the reason why you always want to be moving forward when you disengage is that'll keep you from having a little skin tag, meaning shaving stuck there. Then I would start here, and I would go again, and I come a little bit farther, and then while moving forward, I would disengage. And I would keep working my way back until I take one cleanup pass. I've now taken this, and I've moved it in this direction. I would come in with my straight edge again, verifying that this is straight, no bumps, and then I would go back using my trusty square with my plane up against here. I would make sure that you avoid the blade. I would go in once again and check it to make sure that I'm like, or make sure I've corrected enough. And if you haven't done enough, you go back and you repeat the process. And you can never take off too much, because if you do, you just have to go the other way. It just takes a little extra work. The other option is to come in here and adjust this. Now, this is the way we make our shooting board. See this little rabbit right here, rebate? We do that so this section of plywood runs underneath the blade so that your blade is never eating away at your shooting board. Now, that would be created naturally. I just like it nice and neat, so I do it beforehand. And we've got enough of a gap in here that if we needed to, if we didn't want to mess with this fence, and this is a piece of, we make these out of Osage orange, and it's really hard, so it's not always fun to plane. If this is good, meaning it's nice and straight, but it's not square to this, I could come in, I could do the exact same procedure I just mentioned, only instead of doing it to this, I could come in, I could do it to that little rabbit. And again, you have to figure out which way you either have to take material off of here or off of here. So I would start and I would do it in stages. Take a pass, back up, take a pass, back up, take a pass, and keep doing that. I want to check, might need a longer straight edge. Come in with my straight edge and make sure again that I've kept that nice and straight. I don't want that to be going either way. I want it to be straight from one end to the other. And if your shooting board is worth saving and it's just out a little bit, this is not a hard procedure. You can use the bench rabbiting plane. You can use the shoulder plane to do it. Same procedure. You could even use one of these little small rabbiting block planes. Anything that gives you access right to the edge of the blade. Only problem with the short planes is you don't have the advantage of a long-bodied plane to make a long edge like this nice and straight with using the plane itself. You've got to go in there and be very careful about how you do it, but it is doable. And then again, if it's really bad, start over and just be a little more careful when you actually glue this in place. And I will mention that too. When we do this, I always make sure I have both chemical and mechanical fasteners, meaning I glue this, but I also reinforce it with screws on the bottom side. You can see the screws underneath. Now, the problem is this. When you put that on, if you glue it and try to clamp it, it's going to always move on you. If you just screw it, it'll always work itself just a little bit loose. So the glue is like welding wood. So what I do is I put this in position using my square, put enough glue on there to hold it, but not a lot, which makes it move around. And I will sit there and I will hold it like this, applying downward pressure with my hand, keeping things nice and square. Put one or two CCR songs on there for about 5 or 6 minutes. And at that point, I'll back off. I'll let it sit for a couple minutes, maybe another 10, and then come in and clamp it. And by that time, it should have tacked enough that it'll stay in place. The clamps will just help spread the glue a little bit more. Once the glue is dry, 30 minutes, 40 minutes later, then I come in and I put my screws in. The screws will help hold it. The glue will keep it in place, but the screws just provide that extra support. And at that stage, it's going to stay put. You're not going to have to worry about it moving. Okay, so everything checks out. Blade is sharp. Looks like everything is working properly, but for some reason, you're still not getting the results you want. So let's go through the process of actually using your shooting board, because there's a lot of stuff going on, and they all have to be done in unison, and they have to be done properly in order for this to work out. And one tip I'll give you is you might want to clamp this in place. And the reason I say that, it's nice to have everything solid so I don't have to worry about moving the board around itself. Sometimes I just do up against the bench dog, but if I'm going to do any amount of shooting, I'll actually throw a clamp on there. All right, some of the basics. The plane needs to be standing plumb. So I always have my hand right over the widest part. I don't grab it back here. There's not a whole lot of surface area on a bench plane, and the widest part is right here. So using my grip, which really improves this, selling that one hard. Now, I'm going to make sure that that is standing plumb. So and when I say that, I've had students who have actually tipped in trying to get the blade to engage there without even realizing they're tipping their plane in like this. How do I know that? Because they've cut a chamfer on the end of their board. They've moved it over so much. This has to stand plumb. It also has to stay tight to the track. If you allow that to drift away, you've lost your square setup. So if we remember that we have to keep this standing plumb and tight to the track. Obviously, we're going to be pushing this forward and pulling it back. One of the things about a shooting board is you can't start back here. You're making a tough cut through end grain. You have to be engaged with the plane before you start pushing. If not, you're going to end up whacking the side of it. So the longer you have from the tip of the plane to the blade, the more of a run you can get at it. So for that reason, big number 8 or number 7 are actually the best planes in the shooting board. But for convenience, meaning one plane does everything I need, I like this one. Okay, number 2, you want to keep it tight to the table. And that means your hand's got to be right about here. If it's a really long board, I have an extra piece that I'll put out here that is the same as this, and that'll help support that end if need be. The action of the plane is going to keep the board tight to the fence, so you usually don't have to worry about that. The last thing to consider is this. You have to keep feeding the board into the plane. So I've got to be pushing the board in this direction. At the same time, I'm pushing the plane in this direction to keep it tight to this track so that it maintains my square cut. So if I'm pushing with 10 pounds of pressure in this direction, I got to be pushing with 12 pounds of pressure in that direction. I'm just using that as an example. But you can't push this one harder than you're pushing the plane in that direction. And if you do that, don't forget your little chamfer on the end. You can see where I actually went over. See what happens? Pull that fiber out. Bad me. Now, I'd either have to go in there and glue that or take some off. But anyway, make sure you do that. But at that point, putting all those things that we just talked about into play, you should be able to go in there and make a nice, accurate job of end grain with your shooting board. I consider this to be, next to my plane, the most essential tool in my shop for elevating my work. Everything you build is a sum of the parts. And if you allow a little bit of inaccuracy with every one of those parts, put it all together, you got a big problem. Make it as accurate as your eye can tell. You do that, learn to use your shooting board, get some of these pieces that'll help it even better. Make yourself or get yourself a good shooting board. You will never regret it. Like I said, I use mine every day, multiple times. Good luck. If you like my work and enjoy my style of teaching, click on any one of these videos and help take your woodworking to the next level. I've always said, better tools make the job so much easier. If you click on the link below, the chisel and plane icon, it'll take you to our site and introduce you to all the tools that we actually manufacture right here in our shop. It'll also give you information on our online and in-person workshops.